people live on their phone. So if you're not reaching them on your phone right now, you're a little out of date. And that's where you have to continue to try to explore what is new to the market. But the more you add, the more complex. So how do you add and expand in a way that stays connected and streamlines the operations of it all? Those are the big challenges on top of what is the message and how do I make the message clear? Is how do I distribute it?
That was Keith Cawley, Director of Internal, Executive, and Partnership Communications at Bridgestone Americas. Keith's role includes managing internal communications and content strategy, which includes hosting an internal podcast to engage with Bridgestone employees. In this episode, Keith shares insights into navigating diverse audiences, distributing content across different channels, and the importance of storytelling to connect different parts of an organization. We also discuss his work with external partnerships like the Paralympics and why they matter so much to him. Keith Cawley, welcome to Artisanal Insights, or should I say bonjour?
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Oui.
Yeah. We'll talk about your summer Paris escapades here in a little bit.
That's the extent of my French. It'll be a short conversation, yes.
But no, it's great to chat with you again and to caught up on what your role is now. And so I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile, right? Can we talk about your job title? Your job title is, at least on LinkedIn, it's Director of Internal, Executive, and Partnership Communications at Bridgestone. That sounds very important and like a lot of work.
By design, Carla. It's all about the words, yes. I think for simplicity of things, Director of Communications is what I am. I think the scope of that evolves a little bit every, couple of years as we take some internal shifts in priorities and orgs. But at a level of Director of Communications where you're helping with strategy, you're helping with messaging, internal campaigns to communicate very important things. In my role, both internally and externally, it's kind of a dual-facing audience. Yeah.
Internal and external, that's huge for a company like Bridgestone. How do you navigate that?
It's interesting. I mean, a lot of the external can be bucketed very cleanly as external PR or media relations. So you're speaking to a media audience. But at the same time, a lot of the campaigns and the activities that I work on are partnership related or community related. And so there's also the idea of working with nonprofits and working with other industry partners to be able to communicate a shared message. Okay. So that's a little bit some of the external part. And honestly, the internal part is a lot of fun because it's driving teammate engagement and pride and helping people feel connected to not just the company and their day-to-day work, but where we're trying to go and what we stand for as a company. Yeah. So that to a degree goes both internal and external, but especially internally, we have a lot of fun, or it's fun for me to try to engage people around that and help them feel the interest and passion and emotion that I have. Yeah.
Yeah. So to get kind of some perspective here, how big is the team that you have right now?
My role in the last 6 months has shifted a little bit, but for the last 3 years or so, I was managing, including me, was a team of 5. Okay. And we were primarily focused in the Americas, which we would call Canada down to Argentina, but very specifically in North America with that group. So, 4 of the 5 people that were reporting to me were based in the United States, but I have managed people in Latin America. My new role, I'm actually managing a person who's based in Europe now as we kind of do more with our European group across some shared communications. But, mostly in, I'd say, the 3 to 5 person range. Yeah.
That feels small.
Well, it's all a matter. We have a small amount of agency support from an internal perspective. There's certain projects that we get more agency support. Yeah. But I think the day-to-day communications that we've done, particularly internally, is where I'm speaking right now at Bridgestone, is you got to be close to the subject matter and close to where our leader's perspective and vision is to be able to communicate that, in a very clarified way. So we've kept a lot of that in-house, and it's finding ways to share the load in the structure, I think. We have the people who are really good with words, so how do we work with the subject matter experts in their areas to help them tell their story in, a more clear and engaging way than very technical and difficult at some times. So we're kind of a filter, I would say, on helping maybe complex things become simple. It just often depends on how truly complex some things are with how simple you can make them.
Right. That's very true. Yeah. These communications can be all over the place, right? Yeah. So what kinds of content you and your team actually responsible for on a week in, week out basis? Speaking
mostly from an internal comms perspective, that's one of the things that we've been trying to evolve. We bring this conversation from an area of corporate communications, right? We talk internally about the channels of delivery from different mediums, right? Certainly being able to write really well is key, but can you present? Can you present in front of a camera? Can you make it consolidated in language for a newsletter that is consumable to then click through to deeper things? Can you make it more graphically represented in visual monitors and digital screens? So thinking about all the different channels of potential distribution and knowing that your audience is, a place like Bridgestone in the Americas, we have 50,000 employees in the North and South America group. But you even think about their access to information. So we have somewhere between 10 and 15,000 that would be corporate salaried teammates. You'd call them hyper-connected. They have, the Microsoft suite of chat and tools and email and the like, SharePoint online with an intranet. But then you've got retail automotive service center stores.
Right.
You've got manufacturing locations that are 30,000 plus people combined. Those employees do not have email addresses. So how are you getting messaging to them, right? In some ways, it becomes very basic level, giving talking points to group leaders who do stand-ups at the beginning of shifts, right? I mean, it goes all the way across the spectrum of very digital to very basic, right? So when you think of a content strategy, you've got to cover those bases, but how are you also using tools and keeping up to date? Because particularly with that hyper-engaged audience, or any audience, how are they consuming content in their own daily life, day to day? We can't be out of step with that, right? Because then how do we break through looking at a strategy of trying to get more digital tools or trying to get a mobile app that connects to our intranet and different things? People live on their phone. So if you're not reaching them on your phone right now, you're a little out of date. And that's where you have to continue to try to explore what is new to the market. But the more you add, the more complex. So how do you add and expand in a way that stays connected and streamlines the operations of it all? Those are the big challenges on top of what is the message and how do I make the message clear, right? Is how do I distribute it?
Yeah. It all goes back to message and audience.
Correct.
Really.
It's where it has to start, right? What do I want to say? Who do I want to say it to? And what do I want them to take away from it to tell to other people in whatever way they do it? And there's a myriad of ways to do it. There are some bad ways to do it, which is really when you just limit yourself. But it's also difficult in kind of all of this ramble about the big world of complexities. You can't possibly serve everyone, but there's a passion and a desire and a hope that you find some way to serve everyone exactly how they want it with what they want. But it's just not reality. So instead, you kind of look at what are my resources, what are my needs, and how do I reach the greatest amount of people with the most effectiveness or impact? And sometimes that has to be good enough, and then you learn and evolve. Because if you try to touch every single person in exactly the customized way that they want, which there's enough of that in the world, it can overwhelm you, especially if you've got a small team and things like that. But I think the world of content consumption has to drive to a degree the world of content creation, but expectations need to meet in the middle somewhere. Right?
Yeah, that's a tough challenge. So I do want to talk about one of the more interesting pieces of your internal strategy, which is the podcast.
Yeah.
First of all, whose idea was that to do a podcast? I think it makes a little bit more sense now having heard how you're trying to reach audiences. But to me, that's a really unique and internally focused podcast.
There's a couple of different levels to it because the first is the type of content that a podcast is, longer form, deeper of the message, right? And some room to breathe. Honestly, I love that podcasts have their audience in the current day and age where like attention spans are short and everybody's flipping their thumb through a phone and whatever. But there's also an audience who appreciates and wants for that deeper conversation and the deeper level of engagement. So at the time we had a new CEO, so a new leader. The company itself was going through a vision shift of we've always been a tire company through and through. We are a company who makes and sells tires. But the world of mobility is changing where even tires have a connected component. And there's data to be collected that drives decision-making for business owners and car owners. There's safety aspects of what that data can drive. So this world of interconnectivity, we can't just say we make really good tires out of rubber and other components.
Right.
How do we feed our area of expertise into the larger evolving world of modern mobility? So a shift to more solutions-based things around tires is where the company's been moving. But that is a mind share shift of the people who have been with the company for decades and say, we're a tire company. Well, we are, but we're also a tire company that is more than a tire company. So that was a message we had to figure out how to communicate with depth and with relatability and tangible examples to people. And so you look at your content strategy, and you got your intranet, you've got your emails, you've got your graphic design, and a lot of these things you can do a little bit of depth or a little bit of shallow. But then where do we give space for people, especially our leaders, to share what their vision is and the why about doing this in a very clear way and in their own words, right?
Right.
So the idea of let's sit some people down and have conversations. And at the time it was, let's get some leaders to talk about the what we're doing and the why and the how we're going to do it. Let's get some going down the line of some team leaders, some people in individual roles who are doing these things and living these things to give tangible examples and voice to it and allow people to see the world of Bridgestone around them as they know it, but also as it's shifting, right? So that you can feel like you're seeing some of this come to life and understanding why we're doing it. So a podcast made a lot of sense in that, right? You can get some perspective of voice, perspective of experience and depth of dialogue. And so we're like, how do we do that? Right? Luckily, at the time we considered this, it was during the pandemic and people were getting used to more kind of remote connectivity on things out of a necessity. But we launched it in that time period as audio only. And we did it as kind of an MVP process, right? Like, how do we get it out? How do we learn from it? And then how can we expand it? But I say that with a caveat of not without mindfulness, right? I think there's aspects of a podcast that you have to thoughtfully, design.
Right.
Because the biggest misnomer or the misdirection on these things is the content exists, everyone will consume it. Right. So hundreds of thousands of people are going to be listening to me tell them about all the hundreds of thousands of people listening to our no, it's not. Just because something exists, it doesn't find its right audience. It's not promoted well. Like it's got to be thoughtfully, at least on the front end, discussed. So we talked about length. We talked about the design of the conversations. Is it one guest or is it two guests? What's the format of, are those guests together or are they in separated interviews as part of the same episode?
Right.
We talked about how do we want to distribute it from a cadence perspective? How often do we do these? So all of those things were discussed and designed on the front end to kind of set us up with some form of consistency so that we weren't always evolving it and throwing people off. And then we were able to build an audience that, in my mind, would I have loved it to keep growing organically and exponentially over time? Yes. And we made moves to try to make it as accessible as possible. So it is an internal-facing podcast, but it's available on YouTube. It's available on all of the podcast apps, right? Because we just needed to make it as accessible as possible for people to find it where they consume podcasts as employees. But am I really thinking that tens of thousands of people that don't work for Bridgestone are going to listen to this or supposed to listen to this? No, right? It is designed for a target audience. If we could connect with that audience and over time show consistency that audience kept coming back and our numbers stayed consistent, that was the win to me. So again, what were your expectations on the front end going in? If I needed 10% growth in my audience every year, we would have cut this thing after year 3 because it's not doing that. But that's not the design of it. So we're talking to the people that we know are there and they keep coming back. And that's what made it important to us. So all of those factors went into another content channel for us to tell the story in a different but an important way.
Yeah.
So your 17-minute dialogue that I rambled too long on podcast.
No, that's like understanding that whole, like how it came to be and the purpose behind it is really important. And I think we tend to lose that a lot of times. We get, like you were saying, caught up in the numbers of the growth and all that. And that was never the intent of what you were trying to do.
Yeah.
What kind of reception did you get internally from the podcast?
Initially, and still positive, right? I think, again, comes to the understanding that podcasts aren't for everyone. So we couldn't anchor our entire comm strategy to the podcast is the first and foremost thing. It is another tool in the box. But the people who listen to it, it warmed my heart because the production value was good enough, the conversation was good enough that they appreciated it for what it was intended to be, which was a quality podcast that delivered you a message that we needed you to hear. And they continued to come back and engage with it in a consistent audience size. And honestly, what we would find is that your hyper-engaged teammates are going to engage in things like that because they are motivated to consume content about the company. They want to understand the why. It helps them understand what they're doing day to day. So they seek out information. And so especially those groups, we got incredibly positive reaction because they were hearing perspectives and voices that they otherwise would never have come across. We covered areas of the business. Bridgestone is incredibly complex, right?
Yeah.
You think we're a tire company, but there's all these subsidiary businesses and all these different aspects of what we do that connect together, in the thread, but it's not just we make and sell tires. So we explored areas of the business that if you worked in just commercial tire your entire career, you've never thought about half of these other areas.
Right.
And we're bringing it to life, but also telling you how this area connects to you and why it all connects together, which is, again, part of the intent.
Thinking about this as like the enterprise level, like you do have that wide scope of things, but even thinking about like smaller communications managers, maybe you're working at a small business or nonprofits, that aspect of storytelling to connect everything through. Obviously, it seems like that's really important to what you're trying to do. So can you tell a little bit more about that? But also things that you've learned along the way that could apply even outside of the large enterprise kind of.
Yeah, I think it's just the style of, honestly, how the podcast comes across is another thoughtful thing to say. What is my intention in the type of message? Is it something to be more entertainment where I want to keep people engaged, but more in a lighthearted way where they feel like this is fun and they're also maybe learning something along the way? Or do you have very specific deliverables of message and content to drive action that you need to do? I think part of it is the dynamic of the host and the type of conversations you try to have. We could have tried to have very technical conversations on this podcast. We have engineers, we have incredibly smart people that are product development and technical centers, and they live in chemistry, and this is well beyond me, right? I'm a talker. I just talk to people and try to make sense of things. So we decided to say, how do we just engage on a person-to-person level, but start from the ground up at the bare minimum? One of the things I've learned and I think is important in any place you're doing communications or content is the curse of knowledge and being aware of it, or the curse of like repetition and familiarity, right? Just because I know it does not mean everybody else knows it. I am a subject matter expert in certain things because I've lived my career in them now, but that doesn't mean that I can just go talk to everybody at that same level and they immediately understand everything.
Right.
So when I'm bringing in people from different areas of the business, I may be more familiar with some than others, but I have to approach all of those conversations from the standpoint of the ones I don't know anything about. And I actually am seeking to learn in the conversation because that's how a good chunk of our audience needs to experience that.
Yeah.
So whatever your level of knowledge is, if you're the host or the guider of the conversation, how are you approaching the conversation to serve the purpose of the audience you're looking to reach? And then that goes into your conversation style, your interview style, the questions you ask. It needs to be thoughtful, right?
How do you surface the stories? Is that something that your team is responsible for, or do other people bring them to you and say, hey, we should figure something out for this particular division or this particular aspect?
Particularly as the podcast gained momentum, and people get more familiar with it, they start to, pop ideas out to you. Hey, this would be cool for you to talk about, or it's their own area. And they're like, I would like to come on the podcast and you talk to me about this, which is fun, right? That's the way it's supposed to be, where it's not a pull out. It's people coming and saying, this would be great. I want to hear about this. But then at the same time, we would have to balance them with what are the larger objectives of the vision, the mission, the corporate narrative that was the purpose, right, of trying to get people to connect to. So some would be probably very interesting conversations, but do they serve the purpose of what we needed the episodes to do? And it wasn't the only thing we did every day. So if all I did was make the podcast, I'd probably be incredibly happy and we'd pump out a ton of episodes. But you have to pick and choose. We were doing, I think, about 15-ish, 18-ish a year. So it was like first half, we would do 6 to 8. Second half, we would do 6 to 8 with a break in the holidays and a break in the summer. So that at least you got a set calendar in that. But in saying that, you can't do every single story that comes through the desk. So it was a lot of evaluating from a need perspective. Is there an area of the business or an area of this corporate narrative that we are lacking perspective on right now, and we need to hear a voice and need to get that out there, versus these are things that people have responded really well to, and we know we could get good engagement and really interesting stuff, but where does it fit in the overall, right?
Yeah.
So it's both.
Interesting. Workflow. Have you found anything along the ways that has helped you kind of organize things other than like internal, or is it still just as chaotic as I imagine?
No, I mean, let's have self-awareness in some of these things. I'm a terrible organizer, attention to detail. Like I am a storyteller. I joke about these things because if anybody's lived in a corporate world, and I can understand, like I know a lot of our audience will be very, creatives and independent content creators and people who are motivated. I know to a lot of the creative audience, corporate sounds awful and not sexy, right? Mm-hmm. But what I've loved about it is taking the outside creativity and trying to find ways to push that into the corporate environment. And I think our podcast was one of those things.
Yeah.
Trying to help people feel comfortable with this being a medium of information was to a degree a challenge. But then when you see the outcome of it and how people respond to it, it's very helpful to try new things. But what I will say is I've taken 7 DISC assessments about my personality and behavior styles at work and whatever. And I mean, I am a hardcore I, which is your relator, your, networker, wants to be around people and have fun and tell stories, and everybody's having a big old laugh of a time. And so that is the complete opposite of what a good portion of Bridgestone honestly is, which are engineers, attention to detail, show me the numbers, data-driven decisions. And I'm like, this will be great. Trust me. It's awesome. So that's where, from a workflow perspective, I'm probably more loose than somebody you want to ask that question to.
Yeah.
But I know when the deadlines are. I figure out how to get things done. But none of it is possible without, again, thinking of that workflow, at least on the upfront.
Right.
And part of what made us successful is we had an incredibly good podcast partner in terms of production, and they knew what they were doing, that they were able to guide us through. Here are the steps from going from start to finish in an episode. So here's what you need to think about and who's involved, how long it will take from a timeline perspective. So we did all that on the upfront. But you can also, we talk about small individual content creators. Production value can be achieved in different ways. You invest a little bit in a microphone and in recording in an area that doesn't have a bunch of traffic in the background. You can have a pretty good sounding podcast, right?
Yeah.
And it's about making that investment and being thoughtful about it. And if you're doing it yourself, are you recording in batches where the content is not time-based and can be more evergreen, that you can roll them out in a cadence and you give yourself time to edit and produce? And, how are you recording in what type of tool? We could have done this podcast in Microsoft Teams and kept it entirely internal to the company. I could have just scheduled meetings with people and had virtual conversations on like a Zoom call.
Yeah.
And then edited it from within that suite.
Right.
We decided to make it a little bit more dynamic than that. But there's not to say you can't start in places and hone on the real skills and delivery of the podcast, and then add to those pieces as you look to grow. So you can scale it up, you can scale it down in the workflow, in my mind, as much as you want. But I think you have to have the discussion with yourself about what is realistic from the steps that need to be taken from start to finish, and how long will that take me? And it feeds into everything else.
Let's shift gears a little bit to the partnerships that you have. You work a lot with external partners, and we've known each other for a long time, and I know that you do all kinds of fun stuff.
It's the good-looking job from the outside in, and I won't lie, it's a lot of fun on the inside, too.
Yeah. From golf to Indy to how many Olympics have you been to now?
This was my 3rd in Paris, the summer of 2024. I mean, super blessed to say that. But I've worked on 5 now, with the Tokyo and the Beijing games both being kind of during that pandemic era. So I didn't travel to be there on site, but we still did activation around them. Yeah.
Right. Paris. So So you got to go to Paris twice this summer, but the coolest part of what I want to talk to you about was you got to present an Olympic medal.
Carla.
How did that happen? And
I'm very passionate about this. I got to present a Paralympic medal during the Paralympic Games. And I think one of the coolest things, at least to me personally, over the experiences of these partnerships, we started working a lot with adaptive athletes or disabled athletes. And I've just been so taken by that space and am so confused how it doesn't get more visibility, right? And so it's just kind of been one of these things where working with these individuals and their stories are incredibly similar to some of the biggest athletes in the world in terms of how their career arcs have gone and the work that they put in and the type of athletic skill that we marvel at on the top tier series level. It's just not mainstream. And I think you look at society and where we put our attention, I mean, it's just not where normal society puts their casual attention. But to see this space up close and to work in this space now has been one of the most incredible things of my career and my life. I will say it's become increasingly kind of emotional and close to me as I've got aging parents and like I have a parent who's had some mobility challenges in just a natural state. And you start to see how the world isn't built for those people. So we're very off topic from content creation in that regard, but to say they have a story that is not getting told, right? Yep. And so we've positioned a little bit of what we did at Bridgestone over the last couple of years. We talk about we were a tire company. In the larger vertical of the world, we're a mobility company or a transportation company. And one of the Paralympians, Jessica Long, is a swimmer that we worked with a couple of years back. And in our first kind of just like getting to know her conversation, you know, we were talking about like, when you hear the word mobility, like what does it mean to you? And she says, to me, I think of it as a right, not a privilege, but more people experience it as a privilege than a right. And it drives me crazy because she's a double leg amputee who has a little bit more difficulty moving around than most people. And when you think of us as a mobility company, like Jessica Long, how do you drive a car? You're a double leg amputee. And so starting to then learn about that world that nobody talks about, and there's no exposure for that. And the stories are outrageous in that sense. So that became, as a storyteller, as a content creator, for me, an avenue of how do we look to make more of an impact in this space? And does it relate to us? And in my mind, that's why I say we're a mobility company. It does. We're about helping people move. So even though they're not involved in tires, we started to get into a space where how does our expertise as a mobility company help, whether it's people with disabilities or, in this particular sense, athletes with disabilities? So there is a ton of equipment that they use in all of their sports in the Paralympics that has rubber components to it. We are rubber experts from a science to a tactical execution perspective. When you talk about friction, rolling resistance, grip, durability of all of these things, what obviously naturally comes to mind is wheelchair tires. That is the one thing we didn't touch.
Interesting.
We didn't do wheelchair tires. But when you talk about wheelchair racers in track and field or in marathon, they use gloves that have high performing, very durable, or they need to be very durable rubber pads where they are very violently contacting the rim of their wheelchair. That wheelchair hand rim also probably needs a rubber component on there to create grip and reduce slip. You think of them competing in hot, humid settings where there's a lot of sweat and moisture. They compete in the rain. All of this stuff comes down to performance attributes of tires and grip and traction. We're working with some of the Paralympic athletes that have prosthetic running blades on soles that are like shoe soles or track spike soles or even just covers for those things. So there were areas that Bridgestone could be of use. Because of our efforts there and Bridgestone being a sponsor, we were offered a couple of slots to have people present medals at the Paralympic Games. I was lucky to be staffing at the time, and people knew how close I had been to a lot of these activities over the last few years. And so I was requested to apply to get one of these spots, and I was granted it. The best part of all of it was that you get randomly assigned an event, like that you have to show up at this time at this venue, and this is the event you're going to present the medals for. And the event was a wheelchair track event. The athlete in it who won bronze was a Team USA athlete named Brian Seaman. He was not a contracted Bridgestone athlete, but he was in the stable of athletes whom were product testers for us.
Wow. And
we worked with him and his coaches at the University of Illinois and a lot of his fellow athletes on developing the rubber pads, the hand rim rubber, and the things that he used in competition. He'd been to, this was his 4th Paralympics, had never won a medal before these games, and he won 2 bronze medals, and I got to give him one of them. And I've been on Teams calls with him talking about the feedback of him using the product and helping our design team make things better. And so you want to talk about just the most not predicted and expected full circle outcome there. That was a really cool moment that I'll never forget.
Yeah. That's incredible. Let's do some local stuff. We want to take the Artisanal Insights questionnaire.
Oh, I've been longing to take it.
Okay. Let's start first. Who is a local creator or creative that we should all be following?
Yeah, see, people are going to, he's sitting in the room, but I just really like Clark Buckner. This isn't a cop-out, guy. Like, I saw Clark Buckner at the Next Awards, and it's just like, it lights up my face. And like, how much time do we have? This is where I feel the need, because he's sitting there, like I have to explain that this isn't a cop-out, but I do love what Clark does for empowering and growing the creator community here. Like, I think he has such a passion for it. What I love about him is his passion for telling stories and connecting with other people and helping them figure out how to tell it themselves in content. And he's teaching students how to do this in the modern world, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So if you're not following Clark, follow him. His content is also based around an adorable little dog, which I don't think anybody can be unhappy about. So Sassy Pup is first and foremost in all the content creation.
The official mascot of Craft Content.
Done.
Yeah.
So it's not a cop-out, but I'm sure it will be perceived as such, and I have that level of self-awareness, but just let Clark do his thing. It's great.
I concur. Okay, second question. What is a hidden gem in Nashville or Middle Tennessee that we as locals take for granted?
Oh, the George Dickel Distillery.
Ooh.
All that to say, the Jack Daniel's Distillery is a very popular attraction for very good reason. I mean, people love Jack. The brand is iconic. The experience at the distillery from a tour perspective or going and learning about is phenomenal. They do a great job. I think less than 20 minutes away is the George Dickel Distillery, and it has its own unique history. And I just kind of love the dynamic separation and the oppositeness about Jack is huge and everywhere and bold, and then here's George and he's very understated, and it's like he's in the backyard of that. I have taken the tour at the Dickel Distillery on 2 different occasions. It has evolved over time, and the more recent one I did was phenomenal and very enjoyable in its own right, especially when you compare it up against Jack. I mean, it's another unique experience, and nobody talks to me about that.
That's true.
I've never talked, anybody I've said that to, have you gone to the Dickel Distillery? They're like, no, but they've all been to Jack.
Right. That's a good tip.
A gem. I know Jack's in a holler. George is in a holler, y'all. It is a holler. So, yeah.
Awesome. So put that on your list. If you haven't been there, go. Okay.
Go have an experience.
Go have an experience. I love it. Okay, and last question. What's your favorite coffee order in Nashville?
It's just as large of an iced coffee as you'll give me with 1 Splenda, and that's as exciting as I get.
If you can go anywhere in town, local coffee shops, where do you go?
I really like Dose.
Nice.
Yeah. I live in Mount Juliet now, so there's a couple of mainstream ones that was where I usually end up. But when I'm back into the downtown area, Dose or Crema is where I usually end up.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of people who've said Crema.
Yeah.
So where can people connect with you, follow you?
The old LinkedIn. The name is Keith Cawley. I'm on all the platforms. I think I'm probably semi-private in some of them, but available in all of them. I'm findable, I think, on all of the platforms.
So. You're findable on platforms, not always in real life, because you might be in Paris.
It's true. I'm findable in all kinds of locations. But yeah, always happy to reach out. I mean, honestly, my email address is not hard either. It's my first and last name with middle initial. So if you can remember my middle initial, J, you can find me on Gmail. It's not going to be hard. But yeah, always happy to connect and chat.
Awesome. Keith, thanks so much for being here today.
No, it was a pleasure. The opposite side of the seat here.
The opposite side of the table. Thanks for listening. Get involved and stay connected with our creative community at craftcontentnashville.org. You can join our conversations on Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed this content, please subscribe or follow, rate and review, and, of course, share Artisanal Insights wherever you get your audio content. Now go forth and craft content. We'll talk with you again soon.